It's Monster Mondays with me, Geoff Arbuckle. It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented by Film Seizure. And you can check out new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. And you know what? I don't just want to talk about giant monsters like Godzilla or King Kong, but I also want to talk about the Universal monsters as well as all the others that make up the rich history of the creature feature. And it's the Universal monster cycle where we're going to for this week's episode.
Death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket.
So after the immense success of Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931, Universal wanted to keep the train a-rolling with the whole horror genre. The first two used classic Gothic novels by the same names, so this time around, producer Carl Laemmle Jr. decided to use the then-present fascination of archaeologists finding and opening King Tut's tomb to create a different type of story.
There's nothing on earth like the mummy.
The original Mummy would create a dreamy and very moody experience. In fact, the only time that you actually see the titular mummy is in the very beginning of the movie. And at the beginning of the movie, archaeologists have unearthed a very peculiar tomb, and it's that of the Egyptian Imhotep. And it turns out that his sarcophagus has been defaced, and there's a warning about what should happen if you read some scrolls that he was buried with. Also, it would appear that he was mummified while he was still living. It's a relatively gruesome scene. Dr. Muller, who is played by Edward Van Sloan, who appeared in both Dracula and Frankenstein as well, decides that it's no bueno to fuck about with anything that was found with Imhotep. But some dude with the archaeologist decides to go ahead and read that shit, and Imhotep wakes up, freaks the guy out, so much so that he goes bat plop crazy and then just rambles off. And it's the last time that you actually see a guy in bandages stumbling about in this movie. Now, 10 years later, an Egyptian by the name of Ardith Bey, who happens to look an awful lot like Boris Karloff, tells a new set of archaeologists where they can find the tomb of Princess Akhenaten. So they take his advice and make a huge discovery that gets transported to the Cairo Museum. Oh, and yes, Ardith Bey is indeed Imhotep, which, come to think of it, every time that I write it, I think that it just is shorthand for in my honest opinion Tep. This is important because he actually quite believes that Princess Akhenaten's soul is somewhere out there and reincarnated into someone who lives presently. It just so happens that he's right about that. Ardith Bey meets Helen, a half-Egyptian chick who looks a whole bunch like Princess Akhenaten. A majority of the 70-ish minutes of this movie features Ardith Bey trying to woo Helen into a situation in which he can kill her and then resurrect her with the original soul so Imhotep and Akhenaten can be like, together and shit.
My love has lasted longer than the temples of our gods. No man ever suffered as I did for you.
We do learn that the entire backstory of their love. She died young, and Imhotep wanted to resurrect her in ancient times, but this was massively looked down upon, and he got caught and sentenced to be cursed forever and buried alive. And as it turns out, it ain't so well received in the present either. Through a literal deus ex machina.
Oh, Isis, holy maiden, I was thy consecrated vestal. I broke my vows. Save me now.
Isis smites that mofo Imhotep and causes him to crumble into dust again. Seriously, Helen, who is sort of kind of aware of her past life now and is actually maybe mentally and soulfully Akhenaten now, literally prays to a statue of Isis, and it smites the bad guy. Her new boyfriend in this movie, played by David Manners, and Edward Van Sloan do nothing to help the damsel in distress. You could probably argue that Helen isn't really a damsel in distress at all in this movie. The funny thing is, The Mummy is a relatively small movie and small story that really only directly affects the central characters. Dracula could greatly affect the world, or at least London, as he turns everybody into vampires and shit. He is the personification of an old evil, or possibly even the devil himself. Frankenstein is about basically killing God and having man be able to create life himself. Plus, the monster is rampaging through a village, so it affects more than just a guy who wants his hot girlfriend back and the loser who likes that girl in the present.
My love has lasted longer than the temples of our gods.
I mentioned that it is a very dreamy movie, and it really is. It kind of meanders and lulls you into less of a sense of calm or security, but it kind of pulls you along like you're a sleepwalker floating through the whole story. The movie is also rather violent and kind of sexual for its time. This movie came out at a time before what's called the Hays Code, which was the rating system before the MPAA took over with the more contemporary system that we know. The Hays Code kind of existed in 1932, but it wasn't heavily enforced until 1934. The flashback sequence during the movie showing Imhotep's crime and punishment used in each of the sort of in-name only sequels that came out in the 40s was actually much more violent and scary in the original. Each subsequent time it was used for those sort of sequels that were, like I said, kind of in name only, it trimmed and cut out stuff that the Hays Code would no longer be cool with. And a lot of those movies were coming out in like consecutive years, particularly the sequels in the 40s. So with each one, it seemed like the Hays Code was trying to trim more and more of it.
A nameless grave. The slaves were killed so that none should know. The soldiers who killed them were also slain. So no friend could creep to the desert with funeral offerings for my condemned spirit.
Now, additionally, actress Zita Johann dressed as Oxynomen in the finale and shows much more skin than you probably would have normally seen in the 30s. She's kind of an object of desire, but also kind of less interested in being someone's lover and more interested in doing what she wants. So she's a little bit more of a modern and contemporary kind of, I wouldn't call her a feminist, but certainly much more independent than you would have seen back in those times. That acts as a pretty good segue to my three things that I like about this movie. First, that pre-code era depiction of violence and a little bit of sensuality mixed in. Like Dracula and Frankenstein, The Mummy does basically take advantage of that lax censorship. Second, the mood and atmosphere is gorgeous. It's less about the gothic feel of the first two Universal horror classics and much more about silence, stalking, and that dreamy haze that the movie can be seen through. And if you don't think that atmosphere is important to a movie, particularly in black and white movies, wait until the day I get to The Wolfman, which is maybe the most atmospheric movie ever made. Lastly, this is the movie that likely cemented Boris Karloff as a legitimate star. He's great as the monster in Frankenstein, but he didn't really have any lines and only made sound. In The Mummy, Karloff is the driving force and the soul of the movie. From this point forward, it was less about his physical appearance and more about his true powerful acting ability and his just sheer presence in a movie.
You shall rest from life, like the setting sun in the west. But you shall dawn anew in the east as the first rays of Amon-Ra dispel the shadow.
That does it for me for this week. If you haven't seen The Mummy, definitely check it out. It's only about 70 minutes long, so it doesn't really ask much of you. If you have seen some of the other Universal classics from that era, that's even more of a reason to check this one out. It's definitely my favorite of the Universal horror cycle that ran from Dracula in 1931, with some references going back even further to The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, but to about 1956 with the release of The Creature Walks Among Us, even though some will say that the end came as late as 1960 with The Leech Woman. But really, I kind of consider the final sequel of the Creature from the Black Lagoon series as being really the end of the classic Universal cycle. In current years, the core monster films featuring Dracula, the Frankenstein monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon have been reissued with new DVD sets and Blu-ray packs, so check them out and add a little class to a monster movie marathon. So until next week, see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday.